They laughed at her tiny helicopter, calling it a toy and questioning why the military even bothered keeping it operational. But when disaster struck and their million-dollar aircraft couldn't reach the trapped survivors, Captain Maria Santos and her supposedly inferior machine became their only hope for survival. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Military Base as Captain Maria Santos adjusted the maintenance schedule on her clipboard. Around her, the flight line buzzed with activity as ground crews prepared the base's impressive fleet of aircraft for another day of training exercises. Massive Black Hawks dominated the tarmac, their imposing frames gleaming in the early light, while Apache gunships sat like predatory birds ready for combat missions. And then there was her assignment, a single Bell 206 JetRanger that looked almost comically small compared to the heavy-duty military hardware surrounding it. The helicopter was a relic from the 1970s, originally designed for civilian use before being adapted for light military reconnaissance. Most of the younger pilots referred to it as the museum piece or worse, Santos's toy helicopter. Maria had been flying the JetRanger for 3 years now, ever since returning from her deployment in Afghanistan, where she'd piloted everything from Chinooks to little birds in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. She'd earned 2 distinguished flying crosses and a Purple Heart during her service, but somehow those accomplishments seemed to carry less weight than the fact that she was now assigned to what everyone considered the least important aircraft on the base. "Hey, Santos," called out Lieutenant Brad Mitchell as he strutted past in his flight suit, helmet tucked under his arm. "Taking the lawnmower up for another sightseeing tour today." His buddies snickered at the joke, which had grown stale months ago but apparently never got old for them. Maria didn't respond. She'd learned that engaging with Mitchell and his crew only encouraged more of their juvenile behavior. Instead, she focused on her pre-flight inspection, running her hands along the JetRanger's smooth hull and checking every system with the same meticulous attention she'd given to million-dollar combat helicopters in war zones. The truth was, she loved the little helicopter. It was nimble, responsive, and incredibly reliable. While the bigger aircraft required teams of mechanics and complex maintenance schedules, the JetRanger was simple and elegant. It could land in spaces that would be impossible for larger helicopters, operate in weather conditions that would ground heavier aircraft, and required minimal logistical support. But those advantages meant nothing to the base commanders who measured success by size, firepower, and technological complexity. Colonel James Peterson emerged from the operations building, his attention focused on the Black Hawks preparing for a major training exercise. The scenario involved a simulated rescue mission in the nearby Cascade Mountains, where a team of stranded hikers, played by junior enlisted personnel, would be extracted from increasingly difficult locations. It was the kind of high-profile exercise that attracted visiting officials and generated impressive reports for headquarters. "Santos," Peterson called out without looking in her direction, "you'll be running communication relay today. Stay at altitude and maintain radio contact with the extraction teams." Communication relay. It was military speak for stay out of the way and don't interfere with the real pilots. Maria had been assigned the same support role for the past 6 months, despite having more actual combat experience than most of the pilots leading the exercises. Her record from Afghanistan included extracting wounded soldiers from landing zones that other pilots had declared too dangerous, flying in conditions that had grounded larger aircraft, and completing missions that required precision flying in spaces barely wider than her rotor disc. But none of that seemed to matter here at Riverside. What mattered was that she flew a small, outdated helicopter that didn't fit the base's image of modern military aviation. The JetRanger wasn't equipped with the latest electronic warfare systems, didn't carry impressive weapons loads, and couldn't transport a full squad of infantry. In the eyes of her superiors, it was a relic that served no meaningful purpose in contemporary military operations. "Understood, sir," Maria replied. though her jaw tightened with familiar frustration. She watched as the Black Hawk crews completed their briefings, their confident swagger reflecting their status as the base's premier pilots. They were good aviators, she had to admit, but most of their experience came from training exercises and peacetime operations. They'd never had to land in a combat zone under fire, never had to extract casualties from locations that existed only on the edge of possibility. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun approached the JetRanger, tablet in hand and a sympathetic expression on her face. Lisa was one of the few people on base who treated Maria with the respect her record deserved, having served as a crew chief on several of Maria's missions in Afghanistan. She understood the skill required to fly the smaller helicopter effectively, and had witnessed firsthand how Maria's expertise had saved lives in situations that would have overwhelmed less experienced pilots. "Another relay mission," Lisa observed, glancing at the operations order on her tablet. "They're really not utilizing your capabilities, Captain." Maria shrugged, but her frustration was evident. The Army has certain ideas about what constitutes effective aviation assets. Apparently, size and complexity are more important than versatility and pilot skill. "The guys don't know what they're talking about," Lisa said quietly, checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "I've seen you put this bird places that would be impossible for any of those heavy lifters. Remember that extraction in the Korangal Valley? You got into that canyon when the Chinook couldn't even attempt the approach." The memory was both painful and proud for Maria. A reconnaissance team had been pinned down in a narrow canyon by enemy fire, wounded and running low on ammunition. The terrain was so tight and the landing zone so small that the larger helicopters couldn't risk the approach. Maria had volunteered to take the JetRanger, flying through a gauntlet of small arms fire to reach the stranded soldiers. The extraction had taken 3 trips, carrying out 2 wounded men at a time, but she'd gotten everyone home alive. "That was different," Maria said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Combat situations require different considerations." "Does it?" Lisa challenged. "Because from what I've seen, the skills that made you effective in Afghanistan would be just as valuable here. But nobody wants to admit that the little helicopter might actually be better suited for certain missions than the big impressive ones." Through the hangar's open doors, they could see the exercise beginning. The Black Hawks lifted off in formation, their powerful engines thundering across the base as they headed toward the mountains. Radio chatter filled the communication frequencies as the pilots reported their progress, their voices confident and professional. This was their element, the kind of large-scale operation that showcased their aircraft's capabilities and justified their status as the base's elite pilots. Maria climbed into the JetRanger's cockpit and began her own startup sequence. The helicopter's single-turbine engine wound up with a high-pitched whine that sounded almost delicate compared to the deep roar of the departing Black Hawks. But Maria knew that sound represented reliability and efficiency rather than weakness. The JetRanger had been flying for decades because it worked, because it could accomplish missions that more complex aircraft couldn't handle. As she lifted off and headed toward her assigned position, Maria could hear the exercise controllers setting up increasingly challenging scenarios for the Black Hawk crews. The simulated hikers would be placed in more difficult locations as the day progressed, testing the limits of the larger helicopter's capabilities. It was good training, she acknowledged, but it also highlighted the limitations of relying exclusively on heavy-lift aircraft for all missions. The radio crackled with updates from the exercise, successful extractions from standard landing zones, minor complications overcome through superior firepower and advanced avionics, and generally smooth operations that confirmed everyone's assumptions about the superiority of modern military aviation. Maria maintained her position at altitude, monitoring communications and feeling increasingly like an expensive radio relay station rather than a combat-qualified pilot. But as the morning progressed, Something in the radio chatter began to change. The exercise controllers were pushing the Black Hawks toward more challenging locations, places where their size and weight might become disadvantages rather than assets. Maria found herself paying closer attention to the tactical situation, her combat experience automatically analyzing the terrain and conditions being described by the other pilots. The mountains where the exercise was taking place were notorious for unpredictable weather and challenging flying conditions. Maria had studied the area extensively during her assignment to Riverside, noting the narrow valleys, sudden elevation changes, and thermal patterns that could turn routine flights into life-threatening situations. The terrain was beautiful, but unforgiving, the kind of place where pilot skill mattered more than aircraft specifications. All units, be advised, were seeing weather deterioration in sectors 7 and 8. Came the voice of the exercise controller. Visibility dropping and wind speeds increasing. Adjust approach patterns accordingly. Maria checked her own weather display and frowned. The conditions were changing faster than predicted, with a storm system moving in from the west that threatened to turn the training exercise into something more serious. She'd seen similar patterns in Afghanistan, where mountain weather could shift from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. The JetRanger continued its steady orbit, maintaining radio contact with the exercise teams, while Maria kept one eye on the developing weather situation. Her small helicopter was riding the air currents smoothly, its size allowing it to slip through turbulence that would buffet larger aircraft. It was a subtle reminder of the advantages that everyone seemed determined to adopt as the morning wore on. Maria found herself thinking about the nature of respect and recognition in military aviation. She'd earned her credentials in the most demanding environment possible, proving her skills under conditions where failure meant death. Somehow those accomplishments counted for less than flying the biggest, most expensive helicopter on the base. It was a frustrating lesson in how institutions often valued appearance over substance, status over capability. The radio chatter was becoming more tense as the weather continued to deteriorate. What had started as a routine training exercise was beginning to reveal the limitations of relying exclusively on large, complex aircraft for all missions. Maria sensed that the day was about to become much more interesting, though she had no idea just how dramatically everything was about to change. The deteriorating weather in the Cascade Mountains was beginning to transform what should have been a routine training exercise into something far more challenging. Maria watched from her altitude as thick clouds rolled through the valleys below, reducing visibility and creating the kind of conditions that separated experienced pilots from weekend flyers. The radio chatter from the Black Hawk crews was becoming increasingly tense as they encountered wind shears and sudden downdrafts that made their heavy aircraft difficult to control. "Dragon 2, adjust your approach vector," crackled the voice of Major Thompson, the exercise commander flying the lead. "Black Hawk, we're seeing significant turbulence in the primary landing zone." Lieutenant Mitchell's voice came back strained with concentration. "Roger, Dragon lead. Having difficulty maintaining stable hover. The bird's getting pushed around pretty good down here." Maria listened to the exchange with growing concern. She'd flown in similar conditions countless times, both in training and combat, and she recognized the signs of pilots pushing their aircraft beyond safe operating parameters. The Black Hawks were powerful machines, but their size and weight made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of turbulent conditions that were developing in the mountains. From her position at altitude, she could see the weather system moving in with alarming speed. What the meteorologists had predicted as a minor front was turning into a significant storm, complete with rotating cells that suggested the possibility of severe downdrafts and wind shear. The kind of conditions that could turn a routine helicopter flight into a disaster if pilots weren't careful. "Santos, are you monitoring the weather data?" came Colonel Peterson's voice over the command frequency. His tone suggested he was beginning to realize that the exercise might need to be called off if conditions continued to deteriorate. "Affirmative, sir," Maria replied. "I'm seeing rapid development of convective activity with rotation indicators in several cells. Recommend immediate extraction of all personnel from the exercise area." There was a pause before Peterson's response, and Maria could imagine him consulting with the meteorology team and trying to decide whether to abort what was supposed to be an impressive demonstration for visiting officials. Calling off the exercise would be embarrassing, but continuing in dangerous conditions could be catastrophic. "All Dragon units, this is Dragon Control," Peterson finally announced. "Weather conditions are deteriorating beyond acceptable parameters. Begin immediate extraction of all exercise personnel and return to base." The radio immediately filled with acknowledgments from the various aircraft involved in the exercise. But as the Black Hawks attempted to collect their assigned hikers from increasingly difficult terrain, the challenges became apparent. The larger helicopters were struggling to maintain stable flight in the turbulent conditions, their powerful rotor systems actually working against them as they created additional downdrafts that bounced off the mountainous terrain. "Dragon 2 is unable to complete extraction at Landing Zone Charlie," Mitchell reported, his voice tight with frustration. "Wind conditions are too severe for safe hover operations." "Dragon 3 encountering similar difficulties at LZ Delta," added another pilot, requesting permission to attempt alternate approach. Maria found herself gripping the JetRanger's controls more tightly as she listened to the developing situation. The exercise personnel scattered throughout the mountains weren't in immediate danger, but if the weather continued to worsen, extracting them would become increasingly difficult. The Black Hawk's size and power, normally considered advantages, were becoming liabilities in the confined spaces and turbulent air of the mountain terrain. "Dragon Lead, this is Santos," Maria transmitted, breaking protocol slightly by offering unsolicited advice. "I'm observing the LZ conditions from altitude. The thermal pattern suggests you might have better luck with a steep approach from the northwest, staying close to the ridgeline to avoid the worst of the downdrafts." The silence that followed her transmission was telling. Maria knew she'd overstepped her assigned role as a communication relay, but her experience in similar conditions made it impossible to stay quiet while she watched other pilots struggle with problems she knew how to solve. "Santos, maintain your assigned position and monitor communications," came Peterson's sharp reply. "Dragon units will handle their own tactical decisions." The rebuke stung, but Maria wasn't entirely surprised. She'd offered tactical advice based on her combat experience and her intimate knowledge of how aircraft behaved in challenging conditions, but her input wasn't wanted. The fact that she flew the smallest, least impressive helicopter on the base apparently disqualified her from having anything useful to contribute to the situation. 20 minutes later, the weather had worsened to the point where even the most optimistic assessment couldn't ignore the danger. 2 of the Black Hawks had been forced to abort their extraction attempts, unable to maintain the precise hover required to pick up personnel from the small clearings where they'd been positioned. The 3rd had managed one successful pickup, but reported significant difficulty controlling the aircraft in the turbulent conditions. "All Dragon units return to base immediately," Peterson ordered. "We'll reassess the situation once weather conditions improve." The decision was tactically sound but practically problematic. Leaving exercise personnel scattered throughout the mountains during a rapidly developing storm wasn't ideal, even though they were equipped with emergency shelters and communication gear. The scenario was supposed to be training, but Mother Nature had decided to make it uncomfortably realistic. Maria watched the Black Hawks struggle back toward base, their pilots fighting headwinds and turbulence that made every mile a challenge. The JetRanger, by contrast, rode the chaotic air currents like a surfboard on waves, its smaller size and lighter weight allowing it to slip through gaps in the turbulence that would have been impossible for larger, Aircraft dot as the base came into view, Maria could see ground crews preparing for the returning helicopters. Emergency vehicles were positioned around the landing areas, a precaution that reflected the difficulty the Black Hawks were experiencing in the deteriorating conditions. The exercise that was supposed to demonstrate the base's aviation capabilities had instead highlighted some uncomfortable limitations. The landing pattern was chaos as the heavy helicopters struggled to approach through gusting winds and variable visibility. Maria watched Major Thompson's Black Hawk get pushed sideways during its final approach, the pilot fighting to maintain control as crosswinds tried to slam the aircraft into the ground. It was skilled flying, but it was also exactly the kind of situation where smaller, more maneuverable aircraft had significant advantages. Lieutenant Mitchell's helicopter was having even more difficulty, the young pilot's relative inexperience showing as he struggled with the challenging conditions. Maria found herself unconsciously adjusting her own controls in sympathy, her muscle memory automatically responding to the visual cues of an aircraft in distress, even though she wasn't the one flying it. "Dragon 2, you're drifting left," came the voice of the tower controller. "Correct your approach and maintain centerline." Mitchell's reply was tense with concentration. "Roger, tower." Having difficulty maintaining heading in these crosswinds, the Black Hawk touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the tarmac with a jarring impact that suggested the pilot had been fighting his aircraft right up until the moment of contact. It wasn't a crash, but it wasn't the kind of smooth, professional landing that built confidence in either the pilot or the aircraft. Maria set the JetRanger down with barely a whisper, the small helicopter settling onto its designated spot as if the wind and turbulence that had challenged the larger aircraft simply didn't exist. It was a subtle demonstration of how the right aircraft for the conditions could make all the difference, but she doubted anyone would notice or comment on the contrast. As she shut down her aircraft and completed her post-flight inspection, Maria could hear the other pilots discussing the challenging conditions they'd encountered. The conversation was a mixture of professional debrief and masculine posturing, with each pilot trying to downplay their own difficulties while emphasizing how challenging the conditions had been. "That storm came out of nowhere," Thompson was saying to a group of gathered pilots. "Conditions went from manageable to severe in about 20 minutes. The Black Hawks just aren't designed for that kind of precision work in confined spaces," added another pilot. "We need different aircraft for mountain rescue operations." Maria almost smiled at the irony. The base had exactly the kind of aircraft needed for mountain rescue operations, but it was dismissed as a toy because it wasn't big enough or impressive enough to meet their preconceptions about military aviation. The JetRanger had been designed specifically for operations in challenging terrain and variable weather conditions, but those capabilities were irrelevant if no one was willing to acknowledge them. The debriefing session that followed was a masterclass in institutional blindness. The pilots and commanders discussed equipment limitations, weather challenges, and tactical considerations without ever mentioning that alternative approaches might be possible. The assumption was that if the Black Hawks couldn't handle the mission, then the mission was simply impossible under those conditions. Maria sat in the back of the briefing room, taking notes on weather patterns and terrain considerations that might be useful for future operations. But she also found herself mentally cataloging all the ways the morning's problems could have been solved with different tactics and different aircraft. The exercise personnel were still scattered throughout the mountains, waiting for conditions to improve enough for extraction, while the perfect aircraft for the job sat ignored on the flight line, the storm that had disrupted the morning's training. Exercise was just the beginning. By early afternoon, what meteorologists had initially classified as a minor weather disturbance had intensified into a full-scale mountain emergency. The National Weather Service issued severe weather warnings for the entire Cascade region, with reports of flash flooding, rock slides, and winds exceeding 60 miles per hour in the higher elevations. Maria was reviewing maintenance logs in the hangar when the first emergency call came in. The base's communications center erupted with activity as civilian authorities reported that a commercial hiking group had become stranded on Eagles Peak, one of the most remote and challenging locations in the mountain range. Unlike the military exercise personnel who had proper equipment and training, these were civilian hikers caught completely off guard by the rapidly deteriorating conditions. "We have a confirmed emergency situation," announced Colonel Peterson over the base-wide communication system. 12 civilian hikers are trapped on Eagles Peak after a rockslide blocked their descent route. Local search and rescue teams are requesting immediate military assistance. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. The same mountains that had proven too challenging for the morning's training exercise were now the site of a real emergency where lives hung in the balance. But the weather conditions that had forced the Black Hawks to abort their training missions hadn't improved. If anything, they had gotten worse. Within minutes, the flight line was buzzing with activity as ground crews prepared the base's heavy lift helicopters for an emergency response mission. The Black Hawks that had struggled with the morning's training exercise were being refueled and inspected, their crews briefing on what would be an exponentially more difficult operation than anything they had attempted earlier. Major Thompson gathered his pilots in the operations center, spreading topographical maps across the briefing table, while weather specialists provided updates on the deteriorating conditions. Eagles Peak was notorious among pilots for its challenging approach routes and unpredictable wind patterns, even in good weather. In the current storm conditions, it would test the limits of both aircraft and crew capabilities. The civilian group is located approximately 200 meters below the summit on the eastern face, Thompson explained, pointing to a spot on the map that made several pilots wince. The rockslide has blocked their primary descent route, and weather conditions are preventing ground-based rescue teams from reaching them. Lieutenant Mitchell studied the topographical data with obvious concern. "Sir, that location is barely accessible even in perfect conditions. With the current wind speeds and visibility, I'm not sure the Black Hawks can maintain a stable hover long enough for extraction. The civilian authorities are reporting hypothermia cases developing among the hiking group," Thompson continued. "We have a narrow window before this becomes a mass casualty event. Weather forecasters are predicting conditions will worsen significantly after sunset." Maria listened to the briefing from the back of the room, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical challenges being described. Eagles Peak was exactly the kind of location where the JetRanger's capabilities would shine. The smaller helicopter could approach from angles that would be impossible for larger aircraft, hover in spaces too confined for heavy lift helicopters, and operate in wind conditions that would ground bigger machines. The eastern face of Eagles Peak featured a series of narrow ledges and rocky outcroppings that created severe downdrafts and turbulence for large aircraft. But those same features would provide wind shadows and relatively calm air pockets that a skilled pilot in a small helicopter could exploit. Maria had studied the mountain extensively during her time at Riverside, recognizing it as exactly the kind of challenging terrain that had defined her missions in Afghanistan. "What about weather minimums?" asked Captain Sarah Rodriguez, one of the more experienced Black Hawk pilots. "Are we cleared to operate in these conditions?" Peterson consulted with the meteorology team before responding. "Weather is currently at the absolute edge of operational parameters for heavy lift aircraft. We're authorized to attempt the mission, but crew commanders have discretion to abort if conditions exceed safe limits." The authorization was careful and diplomatic, but Maria understood what it really meant. The mission was being approved because lives were at stake, but everyone involved knew that the aircraft being deployed weren't ideally suited for the conditions they would encounter. It was a calculated risk that could easily turn into a disaster if something went wrong. "Dragonflight will consist of 2 Black Hawks," Thompson announced. Primary aircraft will attempt extraction while the second provides backup and emergency support. Launch time is 15 minutes. As the pilots dispersed to prepare their aircraft, Maria found herself making a decision that went against every regulation and protocol she'd been taught. She approached Staff Sergeant Chun, who was supervising the preparation of emergency medical equipment for the Black Hawks. "Lisa, I need you to do something that might get us both in trouble," Maria said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Chun looked up from the medical kit she was checking, recognizing the tone in Maria's voice. She'd heard it before in Afghanistan when Maria was about to attempt something that others considered impossible. "What do you need, Captain?" "I need the JetRanger prepped for immediate launch. Full medical kit, rescue equipment, and maximum fuel load. But I need it done quietly, without attracting attention from the command staff." Chun's eyes widened as she realized what Maria was planning. "Captain, you're not authorized for this mission. If they catch you launching without orders, if those hikers die because we were too proud to use the right aircraft for the job, I'll never forgive myself," Maria interrupted. "The Black Hawks are going to have the same problems up there that they had this morning, except now the stakes are real lives instead of training scores." The sergeant looked toward the Black Hawks being prepared for launch, their crews already struggling with pre-flight procedures complicated by the deteriorating weather conditions. She'd worked with Maria long enough to trust her judgment, and she'd seen enough missions go wrong when the wrong aircraft was chosen for political rather than tactical reasons. "The JetRanger is in Bay 3, Chun said finally. "I'll make sure it's ready to go. But if anyone asks, I was just performing routine maintenance checks." Maria nodded her thanks and headed toward the hangar, her mind already focused on the mission ahead. She knew she was risking her career by launching without authorization, but she also knew that the small helicopter she'd been flying offered the best chance of reaching the stranded hikers before hypothermia claimed lives. The radio chatter from the launching Black Hawks confirmed her assessment of the situation. Both aircraft were reporting significant difficulty maintaining stable flight as they encountered the mountain winds, their pilots struggling with the same conditions that had forced them to abort the morning's training exercise. "Dragon lead, winds are gusting to 70 knots at altitude," came Mitchell's strained voice. "Aircraft are experiencing severe turbulence and control difficulties." "Copy, Dragon 2. Continue approach and advise if conditions become unmanageable," Thompson replied, though his own transmission suggested he was fighting his aircraft as well. Maria completed her pre-flight inspection of the JetRanger in record time, her movements efficient and practiced despite the emotional weight of what she was about to attempt. The small helicopter sat in the hangar like a thoroughbred racehorse waiting for its moment to run. Every system checked and ready for the challenge ahead. The weather conditions that were proving so problematic for the Black Hawks would actually work in the JetRanger's favor. The smaller helicopter's reduced weight and size would allow it to slip through turbulence that would batter larger aircraft, while its simpler systems would be less vulnerable to the kind of equipment failures that complicated weather often caused in more complex machines. As she prepared to start the JetRanger's engine, Maria heard the first reports from the Black Hawk crews attempting to reach Eagle's Peak. The news wasn't encouraging. Both aircraft were encountering wind conditions that made precise flying nearly impossible, and the confined approach routes to the eastern face were proving too narrow for safe navigation by heavy-lift helicopters. The emergency she had anticipated was beginning to unfold exactly as she had predicted. The impressive aircraft that looked so capable on the flight line were revealing their limitations when confronted with the specific challenges of mountain rescue in severe weather. And somewhere on a rocky ledge 200 meters below Eagle's Peak, 12 civilians were running out of time while the military debated whether the mission was possible with conventional aircraft. Maria made her final decision and reached for the JetRanger's ignition switch. Sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the rules. The radio reports from the Black Hawks attempting to reach Eagle's Peak painted a grim picture of the challenges facing conventional rescue efforts. Major Thompson's voice crackled through the static tension evident in every transmission as he fought to maintain control of his aircraft in the savage mountain winds. Dragon Control, this is Dragon Lead. Unable to establish stable hover at primary extraction point. Wind shear is exceeding aircraft limitations, and visibility is near zero in the cloud layer. Maria listened to the transmission while completing her final systems check on the JetRanger. She had anticipated this exact scenario, based on her analysis of the weather patterns and terrain features around Eagle's Peak. The Black Hawks were powerful machines, but their size and weight made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of conditions that were developing in the mountains. Dragon Lead, what's your assessment of alternate approach routes? Came Colonel Peterson's voice from base control, though the strain in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Negative on alternate approaches, sir. The eastern face is too confined for safe navigation, and the western approaches are experiencing downdrafts that exceed our recovery capability. Recommend we abort and wait for weather conditions to improve. The recommendation was tactically sound, but practically devastating for the stranded hikers. Weather forecasters were predicting that conditions would continue to deteriorate throughout the afternoon and evening, with temperatures dropping below freezing after sunset. The civilian group didn't have the equipment or training to survive an extended exposure in those conditions. Lieutenant Mitchell's voice joined the conversation, his aircraft experiencing similar difficulties from a different approach vector. Dragon 2 confirming Dragon Lead's assessment. I attempted the northern ridgeline approach and encountered downdrafts that pushed the aircraft down 300 feet in less than 10 seconds. These conditions are beyond the safety envelope for heavy lift operations. Maria felt a cold anger building in her chest as she listened to the unfolding failure. The pilots weren't incompetent, and their aircraft weren't defective. They were simply using the wrong tools for the job, flying machines designed for different missions and conditions that demanded a more specialized approach. The JetRanger sitting in the hangar represented exactly the capabilities needed for this mission, but institutional prejudice against smaller aircraft was preventing anyone from considering alternatives. All Dragon units return to base, Peterson finally ordered. We'll reassess the situation and coordinate with civilian search and rescue teams for alternative extraction methods. Alternative extraction methods. Maria knew what that meant in practical terms. Ground-based rescue teams would attempt to reach the hikers on foot, a process that would take hours in good conditions and might be impossible in the current storm. By the time alternative methods could be organized and implemented, hypothermia would likely have claimed lives among the stranded civilians. Staff Sergeant Chun appeared at the hangar entrance, making a subtle hand signal that indicated the flight line was clear of supervisory personnel. The returning Black Hawks would be landing in a few minutes, their crews focused on fighting the challenging conditions rather than monitoring what other aircraft might be preparing for launch. Maria started the JetRanger's engine, the familiar whine of the turbine spinning up providing a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She was about to commit what amounted to insubordination by launching an unauthorized rescue mission, but the alternative was accepting the death of innocent people because the military was too proud to admit that their preferred aircraft couldn't handle every mission. The helicopter lifted smoothly from the hangar floor, its smaller rotor disc allowing it to clear the building with room to spare. Maria kept her radio communications to a minimum, knowing that once she was airborne and heading toward the mountains, there would be no way to hide what she was attempting. Better to get as far as possible before the inevitable confrontation. With base control, the difference between the JetRanger's performance and the Black Hawk's struggles became apparent as soon as Maria encountered the mountain winds. Where the larger helicopters had been battered and thrown around by the turbulence, the smaller aircraft slipped through the air currents like a motorcycle weaving through traffic. Its reduced weight and size allowed it to exploit gaps in the turbulence that were invisible to heavier machines. Unknown aircraft departing Riverside. Identify yourself immediately, came the sharp voice of the tower controller as radar picked up Maria's unauthorized departure. Maria keyed her radio with reluctance, knowing that her response would trigger an immediate chain of command crisis. Riverside Tower, this is JetRanger 77 requesting clearance for emergency rescue operations at Eagles Peak. The silence that followed was telling. Maria could imagine the confusion in the control tower as controllers tried to process the fact that the base's smallest and least respected helicopter was launching for a mission that had just defeated their most capable aircraft. JetRanger 77, you are not authorized for rescue operations. Return to base immediately. Negative Riverside Tower. I have visual contact with weather conditions and terrain features. JetRanger 77 is proceeding to Eagles Peak for civilian extraction. Maria switched off her radio before anyone could order her to abort the mission. She knew she was burning bridges with every mile she flew, but the image of 12 people slowly freezing to death on a mountain ledge made career considerations seem insignificant. The approach to Eagles Peak revealed why the Black Hawks had encountered so much difficulty. The mountain's eastern face was a maze of rocky ridges and narrow valleys that created complex wind patterns and severe downdrafts. For a large helicopter, navigating this terrain would be like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. But for the smaller JetRanger, the same features provided wind shadows and relatively calm air pockets that could be exploited by a skilled pilot. Maria followed a route that would have been impossible for larger aircraft, staying close to the ridgelines and using the mountain's topology to shield her from the worst of the wind. Her experience in Afghanistan had taught her to read terrain like a roadmap, identifying the subtle features that created safe passage through apparently impossible conditions. The civilian hikers appeared on a narrow ledge about 200 meters below the summit, exactly where the emergency reports had indicated. Maria could see immediately why ground-based rescue efforts would be nearly impossible. The rockslide that had blocked their descent route had created an unstable scree field that would be treacherous even for experienced mountaineers. But the ledge where the hikers had taken shelter was perfectly accessible to a helicopter pilot willing to work within extremely tight margins. The space was too small for a Black Hawk to approach safely, but it was adequate for the JetRanger's smaller footprint. Maria began her approach, using techniques she'd developed during combat rescues in similarly confined spaces. The wind patterns around the ledge were complex but predictable once she understood how they interacted with the rock face. Maria found herself flying in a three-dimensional puzzle where altitude, distance from the rock wall, and rotor disposition all had to be precisely coordinated to maintain stable flight. It was exactly the kind of precision flying that the JetRanger had been designed for, and that she had perfected during years of challenging missions. This is Captain Santos in JetRanger 77. She transmitted on the emergency frequency as she established a hover near the stranded group. I have 12 civilians in sight and am beginning rescue operations. The response from base control was immediate and furious. Captain Santos, you are ordered to abort rescue operations immediately and return to base. You are not authorized for this mission. Maria ignored the transmission and focused on the task at hand. The hikers below were showing obvious signs of hypothermia and exhaustion, but they were alert enough to understand that rescue had arrived. She could see them organizing themselves for extraction, their movements suggesting they had some basic knowledge of helicopter rescue procedures. The ledge was too small for landing, so Maria would have to conduct the rescue using the hover extraction technique that required maintaining precise position while wind and terrain tried to push the aircraft into the rock face. It was dangerous flying that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits, but it was also exactly what the JetRanger had been designed to accomplish. As she prepared to lower the rescue hoist, Maria realized that the easy part was over. Now came the real test of whether her decision to launch an unauthorized mission would save lives or create an even bigger disaster. The rescue hoist descended through the swirling mountain air like a lifeline dropped from heaven. Maria fought to maintain the JetRanger's position against wind gusts that threatened to slam the aircraft into the rocky face of Eagles Peak, her hands making constant micro-adjustments to the controls as she held the helicopter in a hover that would have been impossible for larger aircraft below on the narrow ledge. The 12 stranded hikers moved with the careful coordination of people who understood their survival depended on following instructions precisely. The group's leader, a middle-aged woman in outdoor gear that had seen better days, was organizing the evacuation with remarkable composure, despite the obvious signs of hypothermia affecting several group members. "This is Captain Santos, Maria," transmitted on the emergency frequency, knowing that multiple agencies would be monitoring her unauthorized rescue attempt. "Beginning extraction of the first group. Estimate 6 trips required for complete evacuation." The response from Riverside Base was immediate and predictably hostile. "Captain Santos, you are in direct violation of orders. Abort rescue operations immediately and return to base for disciplinary action." Colonel Peterson's voice cut through the radio chatter with barely controlled fury. "Santos, what you're doing is reckless and endangers both military personnel and civilian lives. You are not qualified for this type of rescue operation." Maria almost laughed at the irony of being told she wasn't qualified for mountain rescue operations by an officer who had never flown a helicopter in combat conditions. Her qualifications included 2 tours in Afghanistan, multiple decorations for valor, and successful completion of missions that other pilots had declared impossible. But those credentials apparently counted for nothing when weighed against the institutional prejudice that dismissed smaller aircraft as inadequate for serious operations. The first hiker clipped into the rescue harness with practiced efficiency, suggesting the group included experienced outdoors enthusiasts who understood emergency procedures. Maria triggered the hoist motor and watched as the cable lifted the exhausted man clear of the ledge, his relief visible even through the swirling snow and wind. As she maneuvered the JetRanger to position the rescued hiker near the aircraft's cabin door, Maria became acutely aware of just how different this rescue was from the morning's failed training exercise. The Black Hawks had been defeated by conditions that the smaller helicopter was handling with relative ease, their size and weight becoming liabilities rather than assets in the confined mountain environment. The wind patterns around Eagles Peak were exactly what she had expected based on her analysis of the topographical data. The eastern face created a complex system of updrafts and downdrafts that would have made stable hover operations nearly impossible for heavy-lift aircraft. But the JetRanger's smaller rotor disc and reduced weight allowed it to slip through the turbulent air like a motorcycle navigating city traffic. "Second extraction commencing," Maria announced as she lowered the hoist again. The next hiker appeared to be suffering from more severe hypothermia, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated as the group leader helped secure him in the rescue harness. Time was becoming a critical factor as the afternoon storm continued to intensify. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent demands for her to abort the mission. "Santos, this is a direct order. Return to base immediately or face court-martial proceedings." Maria switched to a different frequency, one used by civilian search and rescue teams who would be coordinating with multiple agencies during the emergency. "Cascade County Rescue. This is Military Helicopter 77 conducting emergency extraction at Eagles Peak. Request coordination with ground units and medical personnel." "Military 77. This is Cascade County. We have ambulances standing by at the base of the mountain and teams attempting ground approach, but weather conditions are preventing surface rescue operations. Are you able to complete full extraction?" "Affirmative, Cascade County. Estimate completion within 45 minutes if weather holds." The civilian rescue coordinator's relief was audible in his response. Outstanding, 7-7. We were told military aircraft couldn't reach that location due to weather conditions. Maria felt a grim satisfaction at the implicit criticism of the earlier assessment. The military aircraft couldn't reach the location, but that was because they had sent the wrong aircraft for the mission. The JetRanger was proving that the rescue was not only possible, but relatively straightforward when approached with appropriate equipment and techniques. The third and fourth extractions proceeded smoothly, though Maria could feel the increasing strain of maintaining precise hover control in the deteriorating conditions. The JetRanger was performing beautifully, its systems responding exactly as designed, but even the most capable aircraft had limits when pushed to the edge of the operational envelope. Captain Santos, this is Major Thompson, came a new voice over the radio. The Black Hawk pilot who had been forced to abort his own rescue attempt was now witnessing Maria's success from the base. His tone carried a mixture of professional respect and personal frustration. I have to ask, how are you maintaining stable hover in those wind conditions? It was the first acknowledgement from her colleagues that what she was accomplishing might actually require skill rather than just reckless disregard for safety. Maria keyed her radio while lowering the hoist for the fifth extraction. Major, the JetRanger's smaller profile allows me to work in wind shadows created by the rock face. Plus, reduced aircraft weight means less momentum to overcome when wind conditions change. Are you saying our aircraft selection was inappropriate for the mission parameters? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria knew that her answer would either validate years of being dismissed and overlooked, or further damage her already precarious relationship with the base command structure. But with 5 hikers already safe and 7 more depending on her continued success, diplomatic consideration seemed less important than honesty. I'm saying that different missions require different aircraft, sir. The Black Hawks are outstanding machines for their intended roles, but mountain rescue in confined spaces during severe weather isn't one of those roles. The silence that followed suggested that several people were processing the implications of her statement. If the military's smallest and least respected helicopter could accomplish missions that defeated their most capable aircraft, what did that say about their approach to aviation resource allocation? The 6th hiker was an elderly man who appeared to be in the early stages of severe hypothermia, his skin pale and his movements increasingly uncoordinated. Maria could see the group leader making urgent gestures toward him, indicating that time was running out for some of the more vulnerable group members. As she completed the 6th extraction and prepared for the 7th, Maria realized that her unauthorized rescue mission had evolved into something larger than saving 12 stranded hikers. She was proving that institutional assumptions about aircraft capabilities could be dangerously wrong, and that sometimes the most effective solution came from sources that nobody expected to take seriously. The weather was continuing to deteriorate, but the JetRanger was still performing well within its operational parameters. 6 more extractions and the mission would be complete. Assuming the mountain didn't have any more surprises in store for her, the 7th extraction proved to be the most challenging yet. The hiker who clipped into the rescue harness was a teenage girl, probably no more than 17, who had been one of the most severely affected by hypothermia. Her hands were shaking so violently that she struggled to secure the safety clips, requiring assistance from other group members who were themselves showing signs of cold-related impairment. Maria watched the delicate operation below while fighting to maintain her hover position against wind gusts that were increasing in both frequency and intensity. The afternoon storm was evolving into something more dangerous than the weather forecasters had predicted. With rotation visible in the cloud formations, it suggested the possibility of severe downdrafts and microbursts. "Easy, sweetheart," she murmured into her helmet microphone, though she knew the girl couldn't hear her. "We're going to get you out of there." The hoist motor engaged and began lifting the teenager clear of the ledge, but halfway through the extraction, a sudden wind shear caught the JetRanger and pushed it sideways toward the rock face. Maria reacted instantly, applying power and adjusting the cyclic control to arrest the aircraft's lateral movement. But the maneuver caused the rescue cable to swing wildly. For a terrifying moment, the girl hung suspended over a 200-foot drop while the helicopter fought to regain stable position. Maria could see the panic in the faces of the remaining hikers as they watched their companions swaying in the wind, held only by a thin steel cable that represented the difference between rescue and disaster. "Come on, baby," Maria whispered to the JetRanger, her hands making subtle adjustments to counteract the mountain's treacherous air currents. "Don't let me down now." The helicopter responded to her touch like a well-trained horse, settling back into a stable hover as Maria guided the rescued teenager toward the cabin door. The girl's face was pale with shock and cold, but she was alive and safe. Another successful extraction completed despite conditions that continued to challenge both aircraft and pilot. The radio had been relatively quiet during the past few extractions. But as Maria prepared to lower the hoist for the 8th time, Colonel Peterson's voice cut through the static with unmistakable authority. "Captain Santos, I am ordering you to abort this mission immediately. Weather conditions are deteriorating beyond acceptable parameters, and you are putting lives at risk with your unauthorized actions." Maria glanced at her instrument panel, checking wind speed indicators and turbulence readings that confirmed what she could feel through the aircraft's controls. The conditions were indeed challenging and getting worse, but they were still within the JetRanger's operational envelope. More importantly, the 4 remaining hikers on the ledge were showing increasingly severe signs of hypothermia and wouldn't survive much longer without rescue. "Colonel, I have 4 civilians remaining on the ledge who will not survive if I abort this mission," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the stress of maintaining precise aircraft control in the deteriorating conditions. "The JetRanger is performing within acceptable parameters, and I can complete the extraction safely. You are in direct violation of orders, Captain. Return to base immediately or face immediate arrest upon landing." The threat was serious, and Maria knew it. Military justice didn't offer much flexibility for officers who flagrantly disobeyed direct orders from superior officers, regardless of their motivations. But the alternative was leaving 4 people to die on a mountain ledge while she flew back to base to face whatever disciplinary action awaited her. "Understood, sir," Maria transmitted. "I'll return to base as soon as all civilians are safely extracted." It wasn't quite insubordination, but it was as close as she dared come without completely burning bridges with the command structure. She was betting her career on the assumption that successfully saving 12 lives would provide some protection against the consequences of her unauthorized mission. The 8th hiker was a young man in his 20s who moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting the effects of severe cold. Maria could see that his coordination was deteriorating rapidly, making the extraction process more dangerous for everyone involved. The group leader was helping him secure the rescue harness, but her own movements were becoming increasingly sluggish as hypothermia affected her judgment and motor skills. As the 8th extraction began, Maria became aware of a new voice on the emergency frequency. "Military Helicopter 77. This is Channel 7 News. We're monitoring your rescue operations from our news helicopter. Can you provide a statement about the unauthorized nature of your mission?" The last thing Maria needed was media attention, turning her rescue operation into a public relations nightmare for the military. But she also realized that having independent witnesses to her actions might provide some protection against claims that she had acted recklessly or endangered lives unnecessarily. "Channel 7, this is 77. I'm conducting emergency rescue operations for 12 stranded civilians. Please maintain a safe distance and avoid interfering with rescue operations." The news helicopter's pilot responded professionally. Copy, 7-7. We're maintaining safe distance and documenting your operations. We want you to know that from our perspective, you're performing a remarkable rescue under extremely challenging conditions. The comment was gratifying, but Maria knew that media coverage could cut both ways. If something went wrong during the remaining extractions, the same cameras that were documenting her success would capture any failures or disasters that occurred. The 9th extraction proceeded without incident, though Maria could feel the JetRanger working harder to maintain position as the wind speeds continued to increase. The helicopter's engine was running at higher power settings to compensate for the challenging conditions, and she was beginning to monitor fuel consumption more carefully to ensure she could complete the mission and return to base safely. 3. Hikers remained on the ledge, including the group leader who had been organizing the evacuation with remarkable competence despite her own deteriorating condition. Maria could see that all 3 were now showing advanced signs of hypothermia, their movements slow and uncoordinated as their bodies struggled to maintain core temperature in the sub-freezing conditions. 7-7, this is Cascade County Rescue, came the voice of the civilian coordinator. Weather stations are reporting wind speeds approaching severe storm criteria. Are you able to complete the extraction safely? Maria checked her instruments again, noting that wind speeds were indeed approaching the upper limits of the JetRanger's operational envelope. But she was also aware that aborting the mission now would sentence the remaining 3 hikers to certain death. The temperature was dropping rapidly as afternoon turned toward evening, and none of the remaining civilians would survive a night on the exposed mountain ledge. Cascade County conditions are challenging but manageable. Continuing with extraction operations. The 10th hiker was secured in the rescue harness and lifted clear of the ledge, leaving just 2 people on the narrow rocky shelf. Maria realized that she was now committed to completing the mission, regardless of weather conditions or official orders. There was no ethical way to abandon the final 2 hikers after successfully rescuing 10 of their companions. As she prepared for the 11th extraction, Maria made a decision that would define both her career and her conscience. She was going to finish what she started, regardless of the consequences. The penultimate extraction began with the second-to-last hiker, a man in his 40s who had been helping to organize the group throughout the ordeal. His movements were now severely impaired by hypothermia, and Maria could see the group leader struggling to assist him with the rescue harness despite her own deteriorating condition. The wind had intensified to the point where maintaining hover position required constant adjustments, the JetRanger dancing on the edge of controllability as mountain gusts tried to push it into the unforgiving rock face. "Take your time down there," Maria transmitted to the hikers, though she knew time was the one commodity they didn't have. "Make sure that harness is secure before we lift off." The group leader's voice came back weak but determined through the emergency radio one of the hikers carried. "Copy, helicopter. We're being as careful as we can, but our fine motor control is pretty much shot at this point." Maria felt her heart clench at the honest assessment. These people had been fighting for their lives in sub-freezing conditions for hours, their bodies slowly shutting down as hypothermia claimed their coordination and judgment. The fact that they were still functioning at all was a testament to human determination and the leadership of the woman, who would be the final person extracted. The hoist engaged and began lifting the man clear of the ledge, but as he rose through the air, a sudden downdraft caught the JetRanger and pushed it down nearly 50 feet in a matter of seconds. Maria fought the controls, pulling in power and adjusting her collective to arrest the descent, but the sudden movement caused the rescue cable to go slack and then snap taut with a jarring impact that she felt through the entire aircraft. "Please, tell me that cable is still attached," she muttered, checking her instruments while fighting to regain altitude and stable hover position. The hoist motor indicator showed green, suggesting the system was still functional, but the violent jolt had pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. The man on the cable was spinning slowly in the wind, conscious but clearly disoriented by the sudden drop and recovery. Maria could see him gripping the rescue harness with white knuckles, his survival instincts overriding the numbness in his hands as he held on for his life. Getting him safely to the aircraft door would require precision flying that pushed the JetRanger's capabilities to their absolute maximum. As she maneuvered the helicopter to bring the rescued hiker to the cabin door, Maria became aware that the radio chatter from Riverside Base had taken on a different tone. Instead of angry demands for her to abort the mission, she was hearing technical discussions about weather conditions and aircraft performance that suggested the command staff was beginning to understand the complexity of what she was accomplishing. "Santos, this is Major Thompson," came the voice of the Black Hawk pilot who had been forced to abort his own rescue attempt. "I'm monitoring your flight parameters from base operations. How are you maintaining hover stability in those wind conditions?" The question was asked with genuine professional curiosity rather than hostility, and Maria realized that her unauthorized mission was providing an unexpected education for pilots who had never seen the JetRanger operated at the edge of its capabilities. "Major, I'm using the rock face to create wind shadows and working with the terrain features rather than fighting against them," Maria replied while guiding the 11th hiker to safety. "The smaller aircraft signature allows me to exploit microenvironments that would be inaccessible to larger helicopters." "Are you saying the mission parameters were beyond the capabilities of conventional aircraft?" It was a loaded question that went to the heart of military aviation doctrine and resource allocation. Maria knew that her answer would be recorded and analyzed, potentially influencing future decisions about aircraft selection and mission planning. But with one hiker safely aboard and only one remaining on the ledge, honesty seemed more important than diplomacy. "I'm saying that mission requirements should drive aircraft selection, not the other way around. Every helicopter has specific capabilities and limitations, and successful operations depend on matching the right aircraft to the mission profile." The silence that followed her transmission suggested that several people were processing the implications of her statement. If the military's smallest and least expensive helicopter could accomplish missions that defeated their most advanced aircraft, fundamental assumptions about aviation capabilities might need to be reconsidered. The final hiker waiting on the ledge was the group leader, a woman whose courage and competence had kept her team alive through the ordeal. Maria could see that she was now barely able to stand, her body temperature having dropped to dangerous levels while she ensured that all her companions were rescued first. This final extraction would be the most critical, both because of the woman's deteriorating condition and because any failure would leave her stranded with no possibility of ground rescue. "Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully," Maria transmitted to the group leader. "Your hypothermic and your motor control is compromised. I'm going to position the rescue harness as close to you as possible, but you need to focus on getting yourself secured properly." The woman's response was slurred but determined. "Understood, helicopter pilot. I've been thinking about nothing but this moment for the past hour." As Maria prepared to lower the hoist for the final time, she realized that her fuel situation was becoming critical. The extended hover operations and high power settings required by the challenging conditions had consumed more fuel than she had initially calculated. She would have enough to complete the rescue and return to base, but with minimal reserves for contingencies. The weather was also continuing to deteriorate, with wind speeds now consistently exceeding the JetRanger's normal operational limits. Maria was compensating through skill and experience, but she knew that conditions were approaching the point where even the most capable pilot couldn't safely maintain control. The final extraction would have to be executed perfectly, with no margin for error or additional attempts. The rescue hoist descended through the swirling snow and wind one last time, carrying with it the hopes of 12 people and the career of a pilot who had risked everything to prove that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. Maria gripped the controls with hands that had grown tired from fighting the mountain's relentless assault, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her unauthorized mission would be remembered as heroic or catastrophic. The group leader reached for the rescue harness with movements that were painfully slow, but remarkably determined, her survival depending on coordination that hypothermia had stolen from her body. Everything that had led to this moment, the years of training, the combat experience, the institutional dismissal, and the decision to act without authorization, would be validated or condemned by what happened next. The group leader's hands trembled violently as she reached for the rescue harness, her movements painfully slow and uncoordinated as hypothermia robbed her of the fine motor control needed to secure the safety clips. Maria watched from above, her own hands making constant micro-adjustments to the JetRanger's controls as mountain winds tried to push the aircraft away from the ledge at the critical moment when precision mattered most. "Take your time, Maria," transmitted, though every instinct screamed that time was running out. "Make sure those clips are secure before you give me the thumbs up." The woman below fumbled with the harness buckles, her fingers barely responding to commands from a brain that was struggling with the effects of severe cold exposure. Twice she dropped the safety clips, having to retrieve them from the snow-covered ledge while Maria held the helicopter in a hover that required every ounce of her skill and experience. On the third attempt, the group leader managed to secure the primary safety clip, though her movement suggested she was operating on pure determination rather than physical capability. Maria could see the woman's lips moving, probably talking herself through the procedure as hypothermia clouded her judgment and coordination. "Harness secure," came the weak transmission from the ledge, ready for extraction. Maria engaged the hoist motor and watched as the cable began lifting the final hiker clear of the rocky shelf that had been their refuge for hours. The woman rose slowly through the turbulent air, spinning slightly in the wind but maintaining her grip on the rescue harness with the desperate strength of someone who understood that failure meant death. Halfway through the lift, disaster struck. A massive downdraft slammed into the JetRanger, pushing it down and sideways toward the mountain face with tremendous force. Maria pulled in emergency power and fought the controls, but the aircraft was caught in a wind shear that exceeded even her considerable abilities to compensate. The helicopter dropped nearly 100 feet before Maria could arrest the descent, the sudden movement causing the rescue cable to go slack and then snap taut with a bone-jarring impact that resonated through the entire aircraft. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as multiple systems registered stress levels beyond normal operational parameters. "Come on, don't quit on me now," Maria whispered to the JetRanger, her hands dancing across the controls as she fought to regain stable hover position. The aircraft was responding, but she could feel the strain in every system as the mountain's violent air currents tested the limits of both machine and pilot. The group leader hung suspended in the turbulent air, conscious but clearly disoriented by the sudden drop and recovery. Maria could see her gripping the rescue harness with what little strength remained in her hypothermic hands, her survival depending on equipment and procedures that had already been pushed beyond their design limits. As Maria maneuvered to bring the final rescued hiker to the aircraft door, her fuel warning light illuminated for the first time. The extended hover operations and high power settings required by the challenging conditions had consumed more fuel than even her pessimistic calculations had predicted. She would have enough to complete the rescue and reach base, but with virtually no reserves for emergencies or additional attempts. "Almost there," she transmitted to the woman spinning slowly on the cable below. "Just hold on for another minute, and you'll be safe." The rescue took longer than any previous extraction, with wind conditions making it nearly impossible to position the hiker near the cabin door. Maria found herself fighting not just the mountain winds, but also the aircraft's own limitations. as systems strained under the prolonged high-stress operations. Every control input required compensation for wind shear, downdrafts, and the helicopter's growing reluctance to maintain precise position. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 minutes, Maria managed to guide the group leader to the cabin door where willing hands pulled her to safety. The 12th and final hiker was aboard, hypothermic and exhausted, but alive, completing a rescue that everyone had declared impossible when conventional aircraft had been defeated by the same conditions. All 12 civilians extracted successfully. Maria transmitted on the emergency frequency, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of what she had accomplished. Departing Eagles Peak for medical evacuation to Riverside Base. The response from multiple agencies was immediate and overwhelming. Civilian search and rescue coordinators expressed amazement that a military helicopter had managed to reach a location they had considered inaccessible. Medical personnel began preparing to receive 12 hypothermia patients. News crews started broadcasting updates about the dramatic rescue operation that had unfolded in conditions too dangerous for standard aircraft operations. But the transmission that mattered most came from Colonel Peterson at Riverside Base, his voice carrying a tone that Maria had never heard before, a mixture of professional respect and personal bewilderment that suggested fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities were being reconsidered in real time. Captain Santos, you have accomplished something remarkable today. Medical teams are standing by for the evacuees and will debrief your unauthorized mission after everyone is safely on the ground. Unauthorized mission. The phrase carried implications that Maria would have to face eventually, but for now her focus was on getting 12 rescued civilians and 1 damaged helicopter safely back to base. The JetRanger was still flying, but she could feel subtle changes in the aircraft's performance that suggested the stress of the extended rescue operation had pushed several systems beyond their normal operating parameters. The flight back to Riverside took 35 minutes through weather conditions that continued to deteriorate as the afternoon storm intensified. Maria flew a direct route at minimum altitude, conserving fuel while monitoring instruments that showed the helicopter was operating at the edge of acceptable stress levels. Every mile brought her closer to safety, but also closer to a reckoning with military justice that could end her career. Behind her in the cabin, 12 people owed their lives to her decision to ignore orders and launch an unauthorized rescue mission with an aircraft that everyone had dismissed as inadequate for serious operations. The irony wasn't lost on her. The helicopter they called a toy had accomplished a mission that defeated the base's most advanced aircraft. As Riverside Base appeared through the storm clouds, Maria realized that landing would mark the end of more than just a rescue mission. Everything that happened next would determine whether her actions would be remembered as heroic innovation or dangerous insubordination, and whether the lessons learned about aircraft capabilities would change institutional thinking or be buried in classified reports. The JetRanger approached the base like a gladiator returning from the arena, battered but victorious, carrying proof that sometimes the smallest and most underestimated tools could accomplish the impossible when wielded by someone with the skill and courage to use them properly. The JetRanger touched down on the Riverside Base tarmac with a gentle precision that belied the stress and violence of the preceding hours. Maria completed her shutdown procedures with methodical care, her hands moving through the familiar checklist while her mind processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Around the helicopter, a controlled chaos of activity erupted as medical teams rushed to assess and treat the 12 rescued hikers who had been pulled from the jaws of hypothermia and death. Emergency medical technicians swarmed the aircraft, their professional efficiency immediately taking charge of the evacuation process. The rescued civilians were transferred to waiting ambulances with the smooth coordination of people who had trained for exactly this type of mass casualty event. Maria watched through her cockpit window as the group leader. The last person she had extracted was loaded onto a stretcher, conscious but clearly exhausted from her ordeal as the final guardian of her hiking group. Colonel Peterson approached the JetRanger as the medical evacuation proceeded, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his service cap. Behind him walked Major Thompson and Lieutenant Mitchell, the Black Hawk pilots who had been forced to abort their own rescue attempts earlier in the day. Their faces showed a complex mixture of professional respect and personal confusion as they processed the fact that the base's smallest helicopter had accomplished what their advanced aircraft could not. "Captain Santos," Peterson said as Maria climbed down from the cockpit, "I need you to accompany me to the debriefing room immediately. We have a significant situation to address regarding your unauthorized departure and rescue operations." Maria nodded, having expected this confrontation from the moment she had decided to launch without permission. "Yes, sir." "I assume this will be a formal disciplinary proceeding?" "That remains to be determined," Peterson replied, though his tone suggested that serious consequences were indeed being considered. "What you accomplished today was extraordinary, but it was also a direct violation of orders and established protocols. We need to understand how and why you made the decisions you did." As they walked toward the operations building, Maria became aware of the unusual level of activity around the base. Word of the unauthorized rescue had apparently spread quickly through the military communications network, and she could see personnel from various departments gathering in small groups to discuss what had transpired. The story of the toy helicopter that had saved 12 lives was already becoming legend. The debriefing room was filled with more people than Maria had expected. In addition to the base command staff, she could see representatives from higher headquarters, accident investigation specialists, and what appeared to be a court reporter preparing to document the proceedings. This was clearly more than a routine disciplinary action. It was a formal investigation that would determine not just her personal fate, but potentially influence future military aviation doctrine. "Captain Santos," began Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, a senior officer who had apparently been brought in specifically for this investigation, "you stand accused of multiple violations of military law, including willful disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment. How do you respond to these charges?" Maria stood at attention, her uniform still bearing traces of the mountain rescue operation, and considered her response. She could attempt to justify her actions through technicalities and regulations, or she could tell the truth about what had motivated her decision to launch an unauthorized mission. "General, I acknowledge that I violated direct orders and used military aircraft without authorization. However, I dispute the characterization of my actions as reckless endangerment. The rescue operation was conducted using appropriate aircraft and techniques for the specific mission requirements." "Appropriate aircraft?" interjected Colonel Peterson. "The JetRanger is not certified for high-risk rescue operations in severe weather conditions. You put yourself and the rescued civilians at unnecessary risk by using inadequate equipment." It was exactly the opening Maria had been hoping for. "Sir, with respect, the JetRanger performed flawlessly throughout the rescue operation. The aircraft's smaller size and reduced weight made it ideally suited for the confined approach routes and wind conditions that defeated the Black Hawks. Mission success demonstrates that the aircraft selection was not only appropriate, but optimal for the specific challenges encountered." Major Thompson leaned forward in his chair, his professional curiosity overriding the formal nature of the proceedings. "Captain, I have to ask, how did you maintain stable hover in wind conditions that forced us to abort our missions?" "My aircraft was being thrown around like a toy in those downdrafts." "Major, the JetRanger's reduced rotor disc loading and lighter weight allow it to work with wind patterns rather than fighting against them. I was able to use terrain features to create wind shadows and exploit microenvironments that would be inaccessible to larger helicopters. The aircraft's simplicity also means fewer systems to fail under stress. The accident investigation specialist, a lieutenant colonel with extensive flight experience, consulted his notes before speaking. Captain Santos, our preliminary analysis of weather data shows that conditions at Eagle's Peak exceeded the published operational limits for the JetRanger as well as the Black Hawks. How do you explain your ability to operate safely in those conditions? Maria had anticipated this question and had prepared her response carefully. Sir, published operational limits are conservative guidelines designed to ensure safety across a wide range of pilot experience levels and mission profiles. With appropriate training and experience, it's possible to operate safely beyond those limits when mission requirements justify the additional risk. Are you saying you ignored established safety procedures? General Hayes asked, her tone suggesting this admission could significantly complicate Maria's situation. No, ma'am. I'm saying I applied advanced flying techniques learned during combat operations in Afghanistan to expand the operational envelope within acceptable risk parameters. The rescue mission required precision flying at the edge of aircraft capabilities, but it was never outside the realm of safe operation for a properly trained pilot. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement settled over the assembled officers. Maria was essentially arguing that military aviation doctrine was too conservative, that established limits were preventing effective mission accomplishment, and that individual pilot expertise could safely exceed published guidelines when circumstances demanded it. However, the general continued, the exceptional nature of your accomplishments and the lives saved through your actions require us to consider factors beyond simple regulatory compliance. I am recommending that you be assigned to a special aviation development program where your expertise in unconventional aircraft operations can be properly utilized and evaluated. The words hit Maria like a physical shock. Instead of court-martial and career destruction, she was being offered an opportunity to contribute to military aviation in ways that might prevent future institutional blindness and resource misallocation. General, does this mean the charges against me are being dropped? Maria asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Captain Santos, your actions today demonstrated that sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses. The lives you saved and the lessons learned about aircraft capabilities are more valuable to the military than the satisfaction of enforcing regulatory compliance. You will be reassigned to develop training programs and operational procedures that ensure we never again dismiss potentially life-saving capabilities because they don't fit our preconceptions. As the formal investigation concluded and officers began filing out of the briefing room, Maria realized that her unauthorized rescue mission had accomplished something far beyond saving 12 civilian lives. She had forced an institutional reckoning with assumptions about aircraft capabilities and the value of individual expertise that might influence military aviation for years to come. The toy helicopter that everyone had dismissed had proven that sometimes the smallest and most underestimated tools could accomplish the impossible when wielded by someone with the knowledge and courage to use them properly. Maria's career had been transformed from clipboard holder to innovator, and her example would inspire future pilots to question limitations and push boundaries in service of mission success. 6 months later, Captain Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the U.S. Army Aviation Center, addressing an audience of pilots, commanders, and aviation specialists from around the world. The JetRanger sat outside the building, now bearing special markings that designated it as the prototype aircraft for the new Mountain Rescue and Precision Operations Program. The aircraft they called a toy has now saved over 200 lives in rescue operations that conventional helicopters couldn't attempt. Maria announced to thunderous applause. We've proven that innovation often comes from the margins, from the people and equipment that institutions overlook. Behind her, a large screen displayed footage from the Eagle's Peak rescue. The dramatic images captured by news crews, showing the small helicopter dancing through mountain winds that had defeated much larger aircraft. The video had become legendary in military aviation circles, used in training programs to demonstrate the importance of matching aircraft capabilities to mission requirements. The mountain rescue program had evolved into something far beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. JetRangers and other small helicopters were now deployed worldwide for specialized missions, their pilots trained in the precision flying techniques that Maria had developed through combat experience and validated during that unauthorized rescue. Mission. Remember, Maria concluded her presentation, sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who sees the solution. And sometimes the equipment everyone dismisses as inadequate is exactly what's needed to accomplish the impossible. Colonel Peterson, now one of Maria's strongest supporters, smiled from the front row as the audience rose in standing ovation. The woman who had been relegated to clipboard duty had revolutionized military aviation through the simple act of refusing to accept that 12 people should die because conventional thinking said the rescue was impossible. What impossible challenge could you overcome if you stopped waiting for permission? If this story inspired you to think differently about overlooked potential and untapped capabilities, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe extraordinary results come from unexpected places. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone's toy or underestimated solution saved the day. Don't forget to ring the notification bell, because the best stories of human courage and innovation are still being written every day.